Namaste, hello, and a very warm welcome to UPSC for everyone. My name is Abhinav, and in this video, we'll be discussing selected topics from the Hindu and Indian Express for the date 17th of September. Now, in this video, we'll be discussing the following topics. No force can stop our troops from patrolling. So, this is a statement by Mr. Rajnath Singh. We'll see some additional mapping of the Eastern Ladakh sector and the Depsang Plains. A special point called the Y point or the bulge is under Chinese control. So I'll show you that point on map. Then Harsimrat Kaur quits cabinet in protest against two agri bills. So in this, I will tell you about the two bills, their salient features. Then I will tell you why farmers are agitating. Then I will also tell you why the states are against it and what are the concerns of the states. So interesting topic. Then reject this inequitable climate proposal. So basically this is a editorial from the Hindu. Now the UN General Secretary made a statement that India should cut its coal by 45% by 2030. Now the article accuses the global north and the UN of trying to limit the developing countries to a low development path, because they want them to curb their emissions without undertaking emission cuts themselves. So it basically exposes the double standards of global climate change fight, and it also exposes the so-called environmentalists from the first world countries. Then telcos must conduct special security audit of networks. Basically, Department of Telecom has issued orders to all the telecom operators in India to conduct security audit of their networks, because they are using Chinese equipment, and especially from companies like Huawei, which have close contacts with the communist regime in China. So an audit is in order. A push for reform. This basically talks about the need for reforms in UNSC. It gives us a basic brief that it emerged in the post-war era, but it has failed to reflect the stark geopolitical and economic realities of present day. So it needs to expand and it needs to reform. It also gives us an idea about the G4 countries of which India is a part, and they are seeking the expansion of UNSC. 5 metro rail corporations suffered 2,000 crore losses. Now in this, the only important part is that metros come under state governments, and the metro rail policy of 2017 mandates that it is the state governments that need to pay for any debt servicing once the metros are in operation. Then railways to rationalize fares, ministry to notify a user fee for development of stations. So here I will introduce you to the concept of cross subsidization, which is basically responsible for transfer of freight from road to railways and associated problems. So we'll discuss that in detail. Then Pakistan to make Gilgit-Baltistan a full-fledged province as per reports. So a new gimmick by Imran Khan government, they are trying to convert Gilgit-Baltistan into a full province. So we'll see what is Gilgit-Baltistan, right, on the map. Then we'll see its importance. Then we'll see the CPEC angle. I'll show you on map what is CPEC, from which area it runs, right? And then we'll also see how India is responding to all of this. So let's get started. No force can stop our troops from patrolling. So our Raksha Mantri made a statement in the Rajya Sabha yesterday. So we'll just look at the additional points what he said, and we'll look into some other aspects of this standoff that is taking place. Now first let us look at the Eastern Ladakh sector. This is Karakoram Pass, Daulat Beg Oldi, Aksai Chin. This is National Highway 219, Chinese National Highway. This is Spangur Western Highway 219. This is Sipki Pass, Demchuk. Then Indus River, Chushul, Depsangla, Rakinala, Siachen Glacier. These are important places that are in news these days. So that is the reason why I am showing these places again and again in videos. This is Aksai Chin. This is Shaksgam Valley, which has been illegally ceded by Pakistan to China. So since early May, the People's Liberation Army troops have made ingress to the Indian side of the LAC, undertaken massive build-ups at several locations and blocked Indian Army patrols from going further. We have already discussed this in so many videos before. There is heavy Chinese presence in the strategic Depsang Plains at a crucial area called the Bulge, which I will just show you. And the PLA troops have also been blocking Indian Army patrols from reaching the patrolling points 10 to 13. I will just show you on the limit of patrolling. The Chinese ingress into this area threatens the Indian positions at Daulat Beg Oldie. Yesterday I told you the importance about Daulat Beg Oldie as well. By bringing Chinese troops closer to the 255 kilometer long crucial Darbuk Shok Daulat Beg Oldie Road or the DSDBO road. I have explained the whole thing in the yesterday's video. Please go and watch that video if you want to understand all this. Depsang is also close to the Karakoram Pass overlooking the strategic Saltoro Ridge and the Siachen Glacier. See, this is Depsang, this is Siachen Glacier, this is Daulat Beg Oldie, this is Karakoram Pass, and this is Raki Nala. Now let me show you the bulge point or the strategic point where the Chinese are sitting right now. So these are the Depsang Plains. Now see, these are mountains, and Depsang Plains are plains from where incursions can take place from either side. That is why it is important to have control over these plains. This is the Daulat Beg Oldie IAF base, and yesterday I told you that we are even sending tanks to this base. Now these are the patrolling points 10, 11, 12 and 13. Now Chinese are sitting here and they are blocking our patrolling in this important area. So I'm sure we'll get this area back real time soon. Pakistan to make Gilgit-Baltistan a full-fledged province as per reports. So another gimmick by Imran Khan government. Recently they unveiled a new map at the SCO meeting where our NSA walked out, and later it came to light that the Russian envoy had advised them not to do so because it was against the protocols at SCO. But Pakistanis are Pakistani. Now let us look at their latest joke. So see, this is the Gilgit-Baltistan region, which is an integral part of India. It is in the illegally occupied POK. Now Gilgit-Baltistan is important for the fact that CPEC runs through it. The China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, which is a crowning jewel of the Belt and Road Initiative. And China has invested heavily into this CPEC project. Now China wants more direct access and control to this area. So Pakistan is making some administrative changes which will serve two purposes. First, serve its Chinese masters, and second, irk India. So let's see. Pakistan has decided to elevate Gilgit-Baltistan status to that of full-fledged province. But what is India's stand? India has strongly objected to this, and we have stated that this is our territory. This move by Pakistani government is illegal, and Pakistani government and Pakistani judiciary does not have any locus standi or legal standing as far as Gilgit-Baltistan is concerned. Now India's objections. India has clearly conveyed to Pakistan that the entire union territories of Jammu and Kashmir and Ladakh, including the areas of Gilgit-Baltistan, are an integral part of the country by virtue of its fully legal and irrevocable accession. India has said the government of Pakistan or its judiciary has no locus standi on territories illegally and forcibly occupied by it. India completely rejects such actions and continued attempts to bring material changes in Pakistan occupied areas on Indian territory of Jammu and Kashmir. So these are the standard responses in diplomatic parlance. Instead, Pakistan should immediately vacate all areas under its illegal occupation. So we have given them a warning as well that vacate this area that you have illegally occupied. Now there is a CPEC angle, like I said, that the CPEC runs through that. The CPEC, which connects Gwadar port in Pakistan's Balochistan with China's Xinjiang province, I will just show you a map of this, is the flagship project of Beijing's ambitious Belt and Road Initiative. So see, this is Kashgar in Xinjiang and this is the Gwadar port of Pakistan. Now this CPEC runs through our territory Gilgit-Baltistan. Kashgar to Gilgit-Baltistan, then Dera Ismail Khan, and then Gwadar. And the other route is Kashgar to Islamabad, Lahore, and then Gwadar. So what is CPEC? CPEC is a collection of infrastructure and other projects under construction throughout Pakistan since 2013, and according to various estimates, China has invested in the range of 40 to 60 billion dollars in this region. Now China is in future virtually going to own Pakistan. As a matter of fact, it already does. It is heavily influencing the Gilgit-Baltistan region, and it is also heavily influencing the Balochistan region. Both of these are going to create problems for China in future. Just wait and watch. Harsimrat Kaur quits cabinet in protest against two agri bills. So Harsimrat Kaur was the Minister for Food Processing in the Union government, and she has resigned in protest of two new bills that have been brought out by the centre. Those bills are Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Promotion and Facilitation Bill 2020 and Farmers Empowerment and Protection Agreement on Price Assurance and Farm Services Bill 2020. Now first I will tell you about the salient features of both of these bills. Then I will tell you why farmers are agitating and what are the issues raised by states. So let us look at them. So the salient features of Farmers Produce Trade and Commerce Promotion and Facilitation Bill. Farmers can now sell their agricultural produce at a place of his choice at a better price, increasing the number of potential buyers. So that means the farmer does not have to sell his produce at the mandated APMC mandi. Essential crops like onion and potato, along with food grains, oil seeds and pulses crops have been excluded from the list of Essential Commodities Act. So what happens in Essential Commodities Act? That center can put a bar on the volume that can be sold outside the mandis or can be sold for exports. So this limitation has been removed. So this might also help the farmer. Farmers can make deals with licensed traders from other states as well. That means intra-state trading can also take place from farmer directly to the buyer and removal of middlemen. This will increase competitiveness in the market and farmers will get good prices for their produce. For example, there's a particular variety of red rice that is being grown in South India, and you are sitting in North India and you want to sell that rice in the market here because you see a lot of potential. So you can directly contact the farmer and have a deal with that farmer without going through the APMC mandi. That will cut a lot of costs and time for you as well. Under this bill, any merchant having a PAN number is eligible for trade. So now anybody, you just go and get a PAN number, register yourself as a merchant, and you can also begin buying and selling. Farmers or traders can engage in trade with a state or other states through electronic trading platforms. So this is basically eNAM, which was launched as an electronic trading platform, and farmers can sell their produce through that. This bill will promote the concept of one nation, one market and allows farmers to sell their produce across the country. So these are good features, but we'll just see that why the farmers and states are resisting these bills. Salient features of the Farmers Empowerment and Protection Agreement on Price Assurance and Farm Services Ordinance 2020. Farmers will now be able to enter into direct agreements or commercial agreements for sale of produce with companies producing food products, wholesalers, retailers and exporters. Basically, this is talking about contract farming. So a new concept is being introduced. After the sale of produce is decided with a company or businessman, the buyer will be responsible for providing necessary means or inputs for good crop yield. So for example, you are a farmer and you strike a deal with a company for growing potatoes. Then once the deal is through, then that it is the company's responsibility to give you the electricity, the water, the implements, the inputs in form of fertilizers, pesticides, insecticides, whatever you need. It is the responsibility of that company with which you've had a agreement. Proper agricultural machinery and equipment will be arranged by the buyer. The buyer will provide technical guidance and advice to the farmer and must take full or partial responsibility for crop risks. So what farmer will do? He has to just grow the crop. The buyer will be giving them some specification that you have to grow this crop as per this specification or this condition, and it would be the buyer who has to take the risk. Now risk can be shared between the buyer and the farmer. In that case, farmer would be getting a higher profit share, but if the buyer takes the entire risk on his shoulders, then probably the farmer will get lesser profit share. During crop production, the crop will continue to be owned by the farmer and crop will be insured, and the farmer will also be able to take loans from financial institutions if needed. So that means during the growing phase, the crop is owned by the farmer, not the company. Company will get the product, the end product, only when the crop is harvested. But during the growing phase, it is the farmer who is the owner of that crop, and against that crop, the farmer can also take loans. Crop grown under the agreement shall be exempted from the rules and laws relating to sale of agricultural produce and the provisions of Essential Commodities Act. So this is also about cutting the red tape as per the government, that we are relaxing the rules. So if you're growing a crop under contract farming, so even if that particular crop were to come under Essential Commodities Act or any other act, but since you are growing that crop under the agreement of contract farming, you will not have to abide by those regulations. Now basically these bills are replacing the ordinances that were already promulgated in June. Now the proposed legislation seek to promote barrier-free trade and farm produce by facilitating contract farming as well as agricultural marketing outside the notified APMC mandis. We've already discussed all this. Now important point, why are the farmers protesting? And if you see, particularly it is the farmers of Punjab and Haryana. Within a day or two, I'll be making a video in which I'll tell you why particularly the farmers of Punjab and Haryana are agitating. Farmers are worried about the dilution of existing MSP regime as well as the entry of corporates with greater bargaining power than small farmers. Now these fears are very valid because it has been seen in other countries like Mexico and other Latin American countries, wherever there has been contract farming with corporates such as Walmart, and especially Walmart is known throughout the world for its predatory pricing. So probably these fears are true. Now about the MSP regime, it is not entirely correct because they would still have the option of selling that to the mandi. Now why are states protesting? Agriculture is a state subject, right? I've already told you that it is a state subject. So states see this as an encroachment upon their rights. The states also say that if you sell the produce outside the APMC mandis, then they will not get the tax from that sale. That will erode their revenue. This is also a very valid concern. States are already reeling from the pressure of GST and the stagnant economic activity. Their financial resources are also very, very limited, and this would be a double whammy on states. So let us see what the developments will be in the coming days with regard to this bill. 5 metro rail corporations suffer 2,000 crore losses. Now this is because of the COVID lockdown. Important points to take away from this are that metros come under state subject because metros are linked to urban development that are exclusively under the state subject. And secondly, the metro rail policy of 2017, which stipulates that the operation costs including any losses are to be borne by the states. So 5 metro rail corporations, Delhi, Bangalore, Lucknow, Chennai and Kochi, have reported combined losses of 2,000 crore due to COVID-19 induced suspension of services. State subject, urban transport is an integral part of urban development, which is a state subject. I've already told you. The metro rail policy 2017, financial stability during operations of the metro rail system, which also includes debt servicing, is the responsibility of the state government. So whatever loans they have taken from international agencies like JICA and others, they have to repay. Only the states have to repay because of this metro rail policy. Another news related to railways. Railways to rationalize fares, ministry to notify a user fee for development of stations. Now, things to take away from this article are: number 1, rationalization of fares, and number 2, user fee for development of stations. So railways levying a very small user fee, 4 paisa per kilometer, to develop certain railway stations. And second is the rationalization of fares. Now what happens? The Indian Railways suffers from a very peculiar problem called cross subsidization. Now railways is a very politically sensitive issue and it gets votes, and till recently India used to have a separate railway budget as well, and there used to be big announcements to satisfy various states depending on which states are heading for elections and which minister is occupying the rail ministry and he is from which state. Now what used to happen, because large number of people travel with the railways, so consumer fares had to be kept low. So see, railway operations are twofold: consumer and the freight, that is the goods that are being transferred via railways. Now to keep consumer fares low, the freight rates were increased. That means cross subsidization, that the losses at one place were being replenished by a surcharge on the other. So subsidy on consumer and surcharge on the freight. Now what that led to? That led to movement of freight from rail to road. So in India you will see that more goods are transferred on road rather than rail. If you compare that to other countries, especially the developed countries, you will see that their freight is largely transferred or transported via railways, but not that case in India. And this cross subsidization and the transfer of freight to road has brought other problems like accidents, pollution, congestion on roads, right? And there used to be high subsidization of diesel, and because of more demand of diesel we had to import more. That also ultimately led to current account deficit. So all of these problems because of cross subsidization. Now railways is eventually trying to rationalize the fares. That means consumer fares would be more realistic and they would be decreasing the freight charges. Now the country has seen the potential of freight and there's large movement of goods in our country, especially since the lockdown. So more and more goods, so more and more freight has to be transferred to the railways. So let's see what the article is saying. The ministry will soon notify a very small user fee which will be levied on travellers to aid development of select railway stations. For passenger trains, the railways had revised the basic passenger fare, increasing it up by 4 paisa per kilometer from January 2020 onwards. This was the first fare revision since 2014-15. Now problem of cross subsidization, I have already described it. Passenger rail fares in India are highly subsidized. As a result, freight train rates had to be increased, leading to a situation where freight movement has shifted from railways to roads. Now private operators are also coming, so they'll start operations by 2023, but the railway ministry is saying that they will set their own fares and they will have to compete with the roadways and airways and highways, whatever, in a very transparent manner. While private operators who are expected to begin operations by 2023 will be free to set the ticket fare, they will need to compete with airways and highways. So let us see what future holds in terms of rationalization of prices and movement of freight from road to rail. It will help a lot of things like reduction in pollution, reduction in congestion, reduction in accidents. So this would be an overall good thing for the economy. Reject this inequitable climate proposal. A very good editorial from the Hindu. It basically exposes the double standards in climate control or the climate change fight. It basically tells us how the UN and the global north are making a fool of the developing countries. Basically what happened, the UN Secretary General made a statement that India should give up its coal immediately and reduce emissions by 45% by 2030. Now for the sake of understanding, I have divided the editorial into certain sections. Like number 1, we'll discuss the track record of India in terms of its green commitments. Then we'll see the double standards of the global north or the developing countries, how they are not basically giving up fossil fuels, they are just shifting from coal to oil and gas, which is costlier option, and India at this moment cannot afford that luxury. And they have not made any commitment to cut their emissions, rather they are just talking about fuzzy terms like carbon neutrality. Then we'll see the first world strategy, which is nothing but a gimmick by the so-called environmentalists because they don't get any traction in their own country, so they push their agenda to the developing countries. Then double standards of UN, that UN never calls out any of the developed countries like America for leaving the Paris deal or the UN for their fuzzy commitments, but it always pushes the developing countries. Then we'll see what would happen if India were to end its coal dependence, what the cost would be, we'll see that in terms of investment. So now let us just get into the article. The UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres called for India to give up coal immediately and reduce emission by 45% by 2030. Now this is a call to deindustrialize the country and abandon the population to a permanent low development trap. India's track record. Now we'll see how India has done so far. India's renewable energy program is ambitious while its energy efficiency program is delivering, especially in the domestic consumption sector. So see, we are working on both the ends. We are trying to bring in renewable energy as far as possible, and we are also trying to improve the efficiency of the electricity products that we are using. You must have seen that they are mandatory BEE ratings on your ACs, coolers, fridge, and all the electronic equipments. And in future, more categories of electronics and electrical products are to be incorporated in that. There is also a green building code, which basically gives the energy efficiency as well of the building. So we are implementing many programs. So we are doing what? Focusing on renewable, plus we are focusing on saving maximum energy. One of the few countries with at least 2% Celsius warming compliant climate action. This is also very good for India. And India is also one of much smaller list of those currently on track of fulfilling their Paris Agreement commitments. Now it also talks about the annual emissions of India. Per capita emissions are really low from India. India's annual emissions at 0.5 tons per capita are well below the global average of 1.5 tons and also those of China, United States and EU. So they have much higher per capita emissions, but they are preaching us the things. In terms of cumulative emissions, which is what really counts in determining the extent of temperature increase, India's contribution by 2017 was only 4%. So India is having a population of 1.3 billion people, but our contribution to temperature increase is only 4%, and these people preach to us. Whereas the European Union with a population of only 448 million was responsible for 20%. So you see the double standards. And that brings us to double standards of the global north or the developed countries. The UNFCCC itself has reported that between 1990 and 2070, the developed nations excluding Russia and East Europe have reduced their annual emissions by only 1.3%. So this person is preaching to us that we should reduce our emissions by 45% and see what these people are doing. Basically, when these so-called developed countries were developing during the era of industrial revolution and before 1970s, there was no climate treaty or no climate concern. So they had an unabated growth and they have been major polluters. So when we go for negotiations, so India believes in the principle of CBDR, common but differentiated responsibilities. It says that these developed countries have been historical polluters. So they have the responsibility. They can't tell us to stop our development just because they have done so in the past and now they do not want us to grow, because we cannot afford the renewable at this point in time, because renewable energy is costly in terms of the infrastructure that's required and we cannot afford that. And industrialization runs on raw power, and that raw power is either you use coal or oil and gas. Now again, India does not have that much money. Coal is the cheapest option, so we don't have any other option but to use coal, not just for electricity to our homes, but major electricity is required for industries, and that can come from coal only. But these people, they just preach without actually practicing anything. While talking about their phasing out of coal, which is often a decade or more into the future, the global north has obscured the reality of its continued dependence on oil and natural gas, both equally fossil fuels, with no timeline for their phase out. So they are not doing that, but they are preaching us. Their commitments into the future set the world on a path for almost 3 degrees Celsius warming. Diverted attention by fuzzy talk of carbon neutrality. Now what is carbon neutrality? There's just fuzzy talk. It is just talk for intellectuals. It is not actually having any impact on ground. And the passage of resolutions declaring climate emergency that amount to little more than moral posturing. So that is all that they do. when it comes to ground action or giving funds or technologies to the developing countries, green technologies, they are never ready to do that. Then it's all about money. A first world strategy tells us about the scam of the so-called environmentalists. The first world environmentalist opinion, while unable to summon up the domestic political support, have turned to pressure the developing countries to bear the brunt of climate mitigation. Their strategies include, see their game plan now, demonizing of coal mining and coal-based power generation, because these are the main power sources for developing countries. Promoting claims that immediate climate mitigation would miraculously lower domestic inequalities and ensure climate adaptation. As a matter of fact, it would increase the inequalities because it would trap the developing countries in a low development path. Promoting third world natural resources as active sites of mitigation and not adaptation. So what is it saying? That they need to reduce but they don't need to adapt. Again, double standards. Promoting theories of degrowth or neglect of industrial and agricultural productivity for the pursuit of change mitigation. So they are saying, and they are preaching to the developing countries that you give up this growth, you just focus on environment. So what will happen when we stop our emissions? They will probably retain their emission levels, but overall emissions would come down, and then they'll be acting like saviors of the entire world, and then we'll be trapped in a low development path, and then they will exploit us even more. All of these are accompanied by increasing appeals to multilateral or first world financial and development institutions to force this agenda onto developing countries. So see, there is heavy politics involved in all this. Double standards of the UN, and we'll soon be exposing the UN as well, because UN is not a credible institution anymore. In fact, our next editorial is also about UN, the UN Security Council. The UN Secretary General has rarely, if ever, called out the US for its withdrawal from the Paris Agreement, or called out the EU nations for their long-term reliance on gas and oil while hiding behind their overwhelming rhetorical focus on coal. The Secretary General has also been promoting the idea of carbon neutrality by 2050 as a national level goals applicable to all without any reference to global and international equity and principle of CBDR, which I've told you that we believe, yes, we have a responsibility, but since the developed countries are historical polluters, they should be the ones who should drastically cut their emissions, and they should also pay us and give us technology so that we can shift our growth trajectories towards green paths. Now, what were to happen if India ended its coal investment? Currently, roughly 2 gigawatt of coal-based generation is being decommissioned per year, which implies that by 2030, India will have only 184 gigawatt of coal-based generation. Meeting the 2030 electricity consumption target of 1580 to 1660 units per person per year, based on the continuation or a slight increase of the current decadal growth rate, will require anywhere between 650 to 750 gigawatt of renewable energy. So if we go on this path and if we go on decommissioning coal-based generation, we would need this much amount, 650 to 750 gigawatt of renewable energy. And this is going to be very costly because the capital investment required is very, very high. So the per unit cost will also be high. Again, it will create a problem for the end consumer. And if government subsidizes that, then again it will create a problem for government because it will have to tax the people. Then again it will create a problem for the people. So basically, the global north should enjoy everything and the global south should suffer for everything. India cannot substitute coal substantially by oil and gas despite some wind potential. A huge part of this growth needs to come from solar, and we are trying to do that, but we have our limitations, especially in terms of patents and the costs required for setting up solar farms. Renewables at best can meet residential consumption and some part of demand from the service sector. Most importantly, see, for industries, you cannot use renewables because industries need a steady state of power, that too at a high voltage. But what happens when the power is produced from the renewables? It is not steady state and it cannot be that high frequently. So applicability of renewables to industries is not that much. Currently, manufacturing growth powered by fossil fuel based energy is itself a necessity, both technological and economic, for the transition to renewables. So first we need to develop our economy, then only can we move to the renewables. So for now we have to depend on the non-renewables. Whether providing 70 to 80% of all generation capacity is possible through renewables depends critically on technology development, including improvement in the efficiency of conversion of energy from its source into electricity. For example, solar conversion efficiency would be around 10%, right? So we need to increase that efficiency as well. Then management of the corresponding electricity grids, because if we directly put the renewables into electricity grid, because of the fluctuation in renewable power, it can destabilize the grid as well. So we need to stabilize the grid. We need to work on that as well. And advance in storage technologies. Most important is storage technology. For example, solar power is available during the day. Now what happens? For example, your requirement for the day was 100 megawatt, but the power generated was 1000 megawatt. But since you can't save this power, 900 megawatt is wasted. Now at night 800 megawatt is required, and you are basically getting that 800 megawatt from the non-renewables. 900 megawatt of the solar that was surplus during the day, had it been stored, it would have served that need for the night, and still 100 megawatts would have been saved. But since we don't have storage technologies, and what are available right now are very, very costly, so we need to work on that as well. Then further, this editorial tells us about how India needs to develop its technology in these fields. Sadly, we are not being able to file that many patents in these technologies and these fields. So if we really need to transition to renewables, we need to work on that. But it concludes by saying that this double talk by the West should stop, and we should look at our own growth trajectory. A push for reform. Now this editorial is from the Hindu, and it is talking about need for reforms in UNSC. Now basically there's a new chairman of UNGA. He is a Turkish person, and he also expressed concern over the need to reform the 15-member body called the UNSC. Now in UNSC 15-member body, 5 are permanent members and rest 10 are elected on rotating basis for a 2-year term, right? But there have been demands, especially from what is known as G4, of which India is also a member, saying that you need to expand the Security Council and you need to basically make it as a forum which reflects the current geopolitical and economic realities of the world. Now these existing powers, including the US, Russia and China, are not happy about this prospect of expansion. They have in the past conceded to the idea of expanding the Security Council, but they are not ready to give veto powers to the newly introduced members. So the G4 says, either you give us all veto power, expand UNSC and give us all veto power, or you abolish your own veto power. So this is a power tussle that is playing. Now let us see what the article is saying. Need for reform. Now the UNSC needs to be more democratic and representative. The political and economic architecture of the emerging global order that the Allied powers shaped at the end of World War II has been altered since then. Now we don't have United States as the sole power, or you don't have the USSR. The global geopolitical realities and the economic realities have changed a lot. So there needs to be a change in UNSC as well. And over the years, UNSC has been a toothless body, and it has been working for the agenda of these members. Sometimes China uses its veto against proposals from India, and then these members like US and UK, they used the veto power unilaterally to declare war over Iraq in 2003. So these are all the problems. The post-war order faces an existential threat to its stability from the revival of nationalism across globe, with some of the powers that enshrine common principles and rules willing to discard them. Number one culprit, China. And we are seeing a resurgence of hyper-nationalism across the world, not just China, but every other country. And every other country is saying that we come first. This is also what happened before the Second World War. The UN remains unreflective of the current trajectory, especially in the strategic and economic arenas. Then there are problem of the veto powers that the UNSC's 5 permanent members enjoy. It is often wielded as a blunt weapon to shore up their geopolitical interests, regardless of the disastrous consequences for the victims of the armed conflict. Now, the UNSC also faces an unprecedented challenge to fashion a collective response to the humanity's biggest problems, which include global warming and the pandemic. And that institution seems outdated for these tasks. Now, the push for reform. G4 are the group of 4 countries, including Brazil, Germany, India, and Japan, which advocate a permanent seat for all of them. Now, there's also a group which has Pakistan as its member, which opposes this G4 grouping. The push for reform gathered momentum following the unilateral declaration of the war by United States and United Kingdom against Iraq in 2003. So since then, more pressure was put. And the General Assembly's 122nd plenary meeting in 2008 decided to facilitate the reform. They said that we'll make an intergovernmental negotiations framework which will come up with a report on how to go about for the expansion of UNSC. Now, the General Assembly in 2015 adopted a resolution to allow the IGN to prepare a framework document. So then there were high hopes that finally there will be expansion of UNSC. But this was opposed by US, Russia and China because they do not want any serious reform to the council, because if there were any serious reforms to the council, they would lose their standing. The IGN process might have outlived its purpose given the absence of a negotiating document which alone could provide a structure for deliberation. So till now, no document has been produced. So IGN is a useless body now. So in effect, there is need for real reforms in UNSC. Either the veto power should be abolished at all, or it should be shared with the new and expanded UNSC. And apart from these countries, there should also be a member from the African continent, because every continent should be reflected or represented in the UNSC. So more reforms are needed. So let's see what sort of reforms are we going to see in UNSC, or whether there will be any reform at all. Telcos must conduct special security audit of networks. So basically the telecom operators in India are using Chinese equipment, and there is a real threat that these equipment would be or could be used for spying on Government of India as well as Indian citizens. And the recent revelations of the hybrid warfare and the snooping activities of China have only strengthened those fears. So the Department of Telecommunication has asked all the telecom operators to do a security audit or a special audit on the network equipment used by them. And this is something that is already there in the rules that they have to undertake such audits on regular basis. Now let us see what the article is saying. The Department of Telecom has directed all telecom service providers in the country to carry out a special audit of their networks by an external agency to ensure security. The move assumes significance as it comes at a time when there are renewed discussions in the country over allowing the use of telecom equipment supplied by China headquartered firms due to security and surveillance concerns, especially firms like Huawei. Huawei has very close links to the Communist Party of China. So there's a very big threat, and countries like US have already banned Huawei, and in Europe also they are banning Huawei for the 5G trials, and maybe India should also follow suit. As per license conditions, each licensee had to get their networks audited for security once in a financial year by a network audit and certification agency. So this is as per the rules, but the Department of Telecom has reminded these service providers or telecom operators to quickly take this audit. So that is all for this video, folks. Thank you. I hope this was helpful to you. Please subscribe to our channel if you like our content. Do press the bell icon so that you don't miss out on any new videos that we post. And if you like our video, please press the like button. Also, please do connect with us on our Instagram page, UPSC for Everyone. So see you next time. Till then, stay happy, stay safe, and have a great day. Namaste and Jai Hind.